Welcome to TEDxGrinnellCollege, a vision of hope. I'm Tess Kirchhoff, a fourth year.
And my name is Creed McClellan. I too am a fourth year, and we are the co-organizers for TEDxGrinnellCollege 2021. We are so excited to host this year's conference and to introduce you to all of our lovely speakers. First, a question. How do you define hope? When we set course in the fall of 2019, planning our conference around this theme, we had no idea what was in store for us. Over the last year, we've had to learn many lessons in resilience, in grief, and in what exactly it means to hope. We realized very early on that there are so many definitions. Between people and across time, the concept of hope is ever evolving.
So we did what any reasonable person would do in the face of such a large task. We asked our friends, and they had so much to say.
Our speakers today come from near and far to share their stories and visions of hope, of community, of connectivity, and of the things that make us human, and we are so very excited to share their stories with you. On a more serious note, hope can often accompany despair, and some of the content today may be heavy for viewers. We encourage you to please take a break, step away from the computer, hit pause if you are uncomfortable, and to please consult the link down in the description below for more specific content warnings if you feel that it's needed.
Our show runs a little under 2 hours with a short intermission in the middle. Without further ado, let us begin.
First talk comes from a brand new member of our Grinnell community, Dr. Shvala Rivera. Shvala currently serves as the Associate Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, as well as Chief Diversity Officer and Senior Advisor to the President here at Grinnell College, a position she began on July 1st of this past year. We are so excited to welcome Shvala to begin our conference.
It was 3 p.m. on May 15th, 2009. I was driving down the Pennyroyal Parkway headed south to begin my new job and my new life in Florida. It was a sunny day, and the 14-hour drive that lay ahead of me seemed to be paved by golden bricks. My teenage nephew was with me and had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. I was listening to music and thanking God for all of his blessings. I was excited, I was happy, I was alive. At 3:45 p.m., I felt my SUV strike another vehicle, and I knew what was about to happen. So I grabbed the steering wheel, I held on tight, and I said, "Lord, I trust you." I then found myself flying through the air as my SUV began to flip about 7 times, and it finally landed on its roof. I knew the moment that my head made contact with the ground and felt what seemed to be lightning course through my body from my head to my toes that I had broken my neck. I was certain of it. At that moment, I felt a sense of peace. I was calm and I was quiet. I was extremely concerned about my nephew. And when I saw him get out of the SUV and that he was safe and well, I was so relieved. And all I could do was thank God for that. My next thought was, now what? I was trapped upside down in a crushed vehicle. How do I get out of this? I found myself crawling out of the vehicle through the back window, and I was able to sit on the ground and prop my body up by the rear tires. As I sat there, I could see the sunshine, I could see my nephew, and oh crap, my dissertation. Where's my dissertation? And all of this wreckage, all of my work, all of my coursework, all of my research was in this mess somewhere. My nephew approached me, and I told him not to touch me or to move me because I knew that I had broken my neck. He began to panic, and I said, "Calm down. I'm okay. It's okay. Please find my laptop bag. I need my dissertation." These were my priorities at the moment. If you have written a dissertation, you will completely understand how I felt at that moment. My priorities were just that. My nephew, dissertation, my neck. He easily found my bag, and when he checked inside, my laptop was fine. I was then lifelined to a hospital where I was told that I had indeed broken my neck. I had fractured my C1 vertebrae in 3 places. I was told that I was lucky to be alive and that I would be a quadriplegic. When I heard this, there were no tears, there was no fear, there was no doubt. Something rose up inside of me, and I told the doctors that I was not paralyzed and that I would walk out of the hospital. I knew that to the core of my being. Why did I know this? I had a vision. I had purpose, and I was alive to live out this purpose. I was going to be fine. I knew it. I believed it, and I said it. The next evening, I walked out of that hospital, albeit slowly and gingerly, but I walked out nonetheless. I'm grateful every day. I'm hopeful every day. Even on not so great days, I'm hopeful. Quite honestly, I'm better for having this experience. I live better, I love better, and I hope better. I'd like to share with you 3 lessons that I learned from this experience. Lesson 1 was believe in your vision and purpose. As you discover your purpose and vision for your life and for your future, write it down. This will help you to make and develop your plans. More importantly, it will help you to see yourself as who you will be and also who you are. When you can visualize your future, it becomes easy to believe in it. I saw myself then as Dr. Shivala Rivera, and that is who I eventually became. This leads me to the second lesson that I learned. That is that hope is greater than any situation you may face. You must believe so thoroughly in your vision. You must be so convinced about your future that you hold on to it and you fight for it, no matter what people say and despite what the circumstances may be. Yes, you may have to adjust the way you do things, just as I did. I had to learn how to walk. I had to learn how to eat solid food and go through physical therapy. But I never lost hope in purpose and in vision. The third lesson that I learned was that my words were powerful. Words represent thoughts and desires. Words can build or destroy. When my left side of my body convulsed seemingly uncontrollably as a result of my accident, I spoke to my arm and I spoke to my leg, and I willed them to listen, to stop shaking. I willed myself to walk. I spoke hope, and I chose to speak words of affirmation daily. I created with my words. It was years later during a Bible class that I learned that the Aramaic word abracadabra literally meant I create what I speak. It's not magic. It's a principle. It became my mantra. I create what I speak. You create what you speak. It makes me smile to know that I can help create a world more peaceful and understanding by the words that I speak, by walking in love, and by giving hope. I was so inspired by this idea of abracadabra that I named my consulting firm Abracadabra. I never wanted to forget the powers of words, the power of my words, and that I needed to be careful with how I use them. Today, I hope to encourage you by reminding you of the 3 lessons that I learned. Number 1, discover your purpose and believe in it. 2, believe that hope is greater than any situation you may face. And 3, speak words of life, light, and creation. When we do these, our vision of hope becomes clearer, brighter, and tangible. Thank you for listening. Be well and live with hope.
Hope is so important in large, sudden, and life-changing events. And I really appreciate Shvela's point that while we can't necessarily plan for catastrophe, we can set ourselves up for success by practicing goal setting and having a personal vision. Although our next talk wasn't recorded specifically for TEDxGrinnellCollege, we feel that it's particularly resonant right now. Johnny Sun is best-selling author and illustrator of Everyone's an Alien When You're an Alien Too, and he recorded this talk at a TED event in 2019. We hope you enjoy his thoughts and drawings as much as we do.
Hello. I'd like to introduce you to someone. This is Jomny. That's Johnny, but spelled accidentally with an M, in case you were wondering, because we're not all perfect. Jomny is an alien who has been sent to Earth with a mission to study humans. Jomny is feeling lost and alone and far from home, and I think we've all felt this way. Or at least I have. I wrote this story about this alien at a moment in my life when I was feeling particularly alien. I had just moved to Cambridge and started my doctoral program at MIT, and I was feeling intimidated and isolated and very much like I didn't belong. But I had a lifeline of sorts. See, I was writing jokes for years and years and sharing them on social media, and I found that I was turning to doing this more and more. Now, for many people, the internet can feel like a lonely place. It can feel like this, a big, endless, expansive void where you can constantly call out to it, but no one's ever listening. But I actually found a comfort in speaking out to the void. I found in sharing my feelings with the void, eventually the void started to speak back. And it turns out that the void isn't this endless, lonely expanse at all, but instead it's full of all sorts of other people, also staring out into it and also wanting to be heard. Now, there have been many bad things that have come from social media. I'm not trying to dispute that at all. To be online at any given point is to feel so much sadness and anger and violence. It can feel like the end of the world. Yet at the same time, I'm conflicted because I can't deny the fact that so many of my closest friends are people that I had met originally online. And I think that's partly because there's this confessional nature to social media. It can feel like you're writing in this personal, intimate diary that's completely private, yet at the same time you want everyone in the world to read it. And I think part of that, I think the joy of that is that we get to experience things from perspectives from people who are completely different from ourselves. And sometimes that's a nice thing. For example, when I first joined Twitter, I found that so many of the people that I was following were talking about mental health and going to therapy in ways that had none of the stigma that they often do when we talk about these issues in person. Through them, the conversation around mental health was normalized, and they helped me realize that going to therapy was something that would help me as well. Now, for many people, it sounds like a scary idea to be talking about all these topics so publicly and so openly on the internet. I feel like a lot of people think that it is a big, scary thing to be online if you're not already perfectly and fully formed. But I think the internet can be actually a great place to not know. And I think we can treat that with excitement. Because to me, there's something important about sharing your imperfections and your insecurities and your vulnerabilities with other people. Now, when someone shares that they feel sad or afraid or alone, for example, it actually makes me feel less alone, not by getting rid of any of my loneliness, but by showing me that I am not alone in feeling lonely. And as a writer and as an artist, I care very much about making this comfort of being vulnerable a communal thing, something that we can share with each other. I'm excited about externalizing the internal, about taking those invisible personal feelings that I don't have words for, holding them to the light, putting words to them, and then sharing them with other people, in the hopes that it might help them find words to find their feelings as well. Now, I know that sounds like a big thing, but ultimately I'm interested in putting all these things into small, approachable packages. Because when we can hide them into these smaller pieces, I think they're easier to approach. I think they're more fun. I think they can more easily help us see our shared humanness. Sometimes that takes the form of a short story. Sometimes that takes the form of a cute book of illustrations, for example. And sometimes that takes the form of a silly joke that I'll throw on the internet. For example, a few months ago, I posted this app idea for a dog walking service where a dog shows up at your door and you have to get out of the house and go for a walk. If there are app developers in the audience, please find me after the talk. Or I'd like to share every time I feel anxious about sending an email. When I sign my emails best, it's short for I am trying my best, which is short for please don't hate me, I promise I'm trying my best. Or my answer to the classic icebreaker, if I could have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, I would. I am very lonely. And I find that when I post things like these online, the reaction is very similar. People come together to share a laugh, to share in that feeling, and then to disperse just as quickly. But yes, leaving me once again alone. But I think sometimes these little gatherings can be quite meaningful. For example, when I graduated from architecture school and I moved to Cambridge, I posted this question: how many people in your life have you already had your last conversation with? And I was thinking about my own friends who had moved away to different cities and different countries even, and how hard it would be for me to keep in touch with them. But other people started replying and sharing their own experiences. Somebody talked about a family member they had a falling out with. Someone talked about a loved one who had passed away quickly and unexpectedly. Someone else talked about their friends from school who had moved away as well. But then something really nice started happening. Instead of just replying to me, people started replying to each other. And they started to talk to each other and share their own experiences and comfort each other and encourage each other to reach out to that friend that they haven't spoken to in a while or that family member that they had a falling out with. And eventually, we got this little tiny micro-community. It felt like this support group formed of all sorts of people coming together. And I think every time we post online, every time we do this, there's a chance that these little micro-communities can form. There's a chance that all sorts of different creatures can come together and be drawn together. And sometimes, through the muck of the internet, you get to find a kindred spirit. Sometimes that's in the reading the replies and the comment sections and finding a reply that is particularly kind or insightful or funny. Sometimes that's in going to follow someone and seeing that they already follow you back. And sometimes that's in looking at someone that you know in real life and seeing the things that you write and the things that they write and realizing that you share so many of the same interests as they do, and that brings them closer together to you. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to meet another alien. But I am worried too, because as we all know, the internet for the most part doesn't feel like this. We all know that for the most part, the internet feels like a place where we misunderstand each other, where we come into conflict with each other. where there's all sorts of confusion and screaming and yelling and shouting. And it feels like there's too much of everything. It feels like chaos. And I don't know how to square away the bad parts with the good, because as we know and as we've seen, the bad parts can really, really hurt us. It feels to me that the platforms that we use to inhabit these online spaces have been designed either ignorantly or willfully to allow for harassment and abuse, to propagate misinformation, to enable hatred and hate speech and the violence that comes from it. And it feels like none of our current platforms are doing enough to address and to fix that. But still, and maybe probably unfortunately, I'm still drawn to these online spaces, as many others are, because sometimes it just feels like that's where all the people are. And I feel silly and stupid sometimes for valuing these small moments of human connection in times like these. But I've always operated under this idea that these little moments of humanness are not superfluous. They're not retreats from the world at all, but instead they're the reasons why we come to these spaces. They are important and vital, and they affirm and they give us life. And they are these tiny temporary sanctuaries that show us that we are not as alone as we think we are. And so, yes, even though life is bad and everyone's sad and one day we're all going to die, I think the inflatable, metaphorical bouncy castle in this case is really our relationships and our connections to other people. And so one night, when I was feeling particularly sad and hopeless about the world, I shouted out to the void, to the lonely darkness. I said, at this point, logging onto social media feels like holding someone's hand at the end of the world. And this time, instead of the void responding, it was people who showed up, who started replying to me, and then who started talking to each other. And slowly, this little, tiny community formed. Everybody came together to hold hands. And in these dangerous and unsure times, in the midst of it all, I think the thing that we have to hold on to is other people. And I know that is a small thing made up of small moments, but I think it is one tiny, tiny sliver of light in all the darkness. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hope really can be found even in the loneliest of places. Though that talk from Johnny's son came out almost 2 years ago, it seems more relevant now than ever. Our next speaker is David Mira, award-winning poet and writer, professor and organizer. David's passion for life is infectious, and we're so excited to share his powerful words with you.
I am a writer and a teacher of creative writing. In both pursuits, one central theme has been my identity as a Sansei, a third-generation Japanese American. For my own story, the story of my family and my community, and indeed the history of America, is intricately bound up with the question of identity. Who am I? Who are we? In his memoir on American film, The Devil Finds Work, James Baldwin writes this about identity. The question of identity is a question involving the most profound panic, a terror as primary as the nightmare of the mortal fall. When identity is questioned only when it is menaced, as when the mighty begin to fall, or when the wretched begin to rise, or when the stranger enters the gates, never thereafter to be a stranger, the stranger's presence making you the stranger, less to the stranger than to yourself. Identity would seem to be the garment with which one covers the nakedness of the self. To question one's identity, Baldwin observes, can induce a terror that rivals reckoning with our mortality. In other words, it's as scary as death. And yet the story of America from its beginnings has involved questions and changes in our identity. particularly in our racial identities. We've seen this past year. I live in Minneapolis, just a few miles from where Philando Castile was killed by a police officer, and a couple miles from where George Floyd was killed by 4 police, and where local protests sparked protests across the nation, and indeed the world. As a result, an unprecedented portion of the white population seemed to awaken to what Black and brown people have been saying for years about police brutality and racism in the justice system. Out of tragedy and injustice bloomed a profound hope and call for change. And yet, at the same time, an increasing portion of the white population has not just criticized these protests, but has doubled down on celebrating racism. There's been an alarming rise of racial microaggressions in white hate groups. We seem to be moving forwards and backwards at the same time. As many know, sometime after 2040, America will no longer be a white majority country. Every racial group will be a minority. There are some white Americans who fear this change, who feel their power, their might, to use Baldwin's term, is waning. Many believe whites have always defined what America is. And no matter what our demographics or elections indicate, whites alone should define America. And yet, America has never been a pure white nation. Instead, it has always been a country where strangers are encountering strangers. And from our beginnings, these encounters have engendered questions of identity from both whites and people of color. From the first encounters with indigenous people to the institution of slavery, from the taking of native lands to the Civil War, to desegregation and the civil rights movement. White identity is always presumed and often exploited those who were not white. Now, we Japanese Americans know what it's like to be the unwelcome stranger, the one who walks into a village eyed with suspicion and fear. Decades of anti-Asian and yellow peril sentiment set the groundwork for the imprisonment of 120,000 of the Japanese community during World War II. My parents, 11 and 15, and natural-born citizens, were taken from their homes without a trial, imprisoned in concentration camps along with their families in desolate areas of Idaho and Arkansas, behind barbed wire fences and rifle towers with guards. In 1942, here's what Tennessee Senator Tim Stewart said on the floors of Congress. "They are cowardly and immoral. They are different from Americans in every conceivable way, and no Japanese should ever have the right to claim American citizenship. A Jap is a Jap, anywhere you find him. And his taking the oath of allegiance to this country would not help, even if he should be permitted to do so. They do not believe in God and have no respect for an oath." And yet, despite such racism, and even while their families were imprisoned, my uncles served in the famed Japanese-American 442nd Regiment, the most decorated unit in the European theater. Generals competed to bring the 442nd under their command because the 442nd fought so fiercely and captured targets other troops could not, including rescuing the famed Texas Lost Battalion trapped behind Nazi lines. Those Texans were at first surprised to see Japanese faces coming up the hill to rescue them, wandering, as it were, into their village. That encounter changed not just those Texans' understanding of Japanese Americans, but of themselves. And afterwards, those Texans sang the praises of the Buddha heads, which is what members of the 442nd called themselves. A lesser-known fact is that Japanese-American military linguists studied at Fort Snelling, Minnesota to help in combat in the Pacific Theater, in intelligence, in interrogations, on the battlefield, and in code breaking. Armed Forces commanders estimated these Japanese-American military linguists helped shorten the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved hundreds of thousands, even millions of American lives. The very cultural background which made them suspicious to so many white Americans became a vital asset to this country, as were the linguistic skills of the Navajo code talkers, made famous in the movie Wind Talkers. Diversity is America's strength, our hope. Our diversity fuels our creativity in the arts, in business, in government, in all aspects of our society. Now, it took America over 40 years to recognize the injustice of the Japanese-American internment. But in 1988, the U.S. Congress and President Ronald Reagan issued an apology to our community. This apology acknowledged that there was no military necessity for the internment. Instead, the real reasons for our imprisonment were racism, wartime hysteria, and the failure of leadership. At this apology, many Japanese Americans, including me, thought, finally, America has recognized this injustice. It will never happen again. Unfortunately, we were wrong. In the years since the first Gulf War, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-immigrant sentiment has risen in this country. The Japanese-American internment has been cited not as an egregious wrong recognized by Congress and President Reagan, but as precedent, as justification for the anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant measures. In the Twin Cities where I live, we have the largest Muslim Somali American population in the country. My children, particularly my middle son Nico, have had many Somali American friends. At the same time, my children have witnessed anti-Muslim sentiment directed towards these friends in the Somali community. A few years ago, one of my son Nico's Somali friends, Abdi, was shot and killed outside a recreation center, most likely a mistaken casualty of gang conflicts. I'm ending my talk with my poem about Abdi's and my son's friendship, a conjunction of two histories, Japanese Americans and Somali Americans. It is an answer to our fears of the stranger who walks into our village. It explores how we question and change our identities, take off our old robes, don new ones, and thus admit our nakedness and limitations, our mortality, but also our ability to hope, to love, and to grow. Poem for Abdi. 10:35. Gnats, mosquitoes blurring streetlights in the parking lot of the Coyle Rec Center. And Abdi's smoking, chilling just after the lights slipped away on this near solstice. And the lines he's on fleek flow through that girl he passed at the Mall of America, the apartment he'll go back to without his mother, return to Mogadishu to aid his dying poet father, heart failing without metaphor. And Abdi thinks, tomorrow I'll be breaking Ramadan. As the beats my son Nico laid down for him start to jump. My brain ain't neurological, beyond ecological. I've torched the devil's follicles, stroking his blood-red tail, thinking where we failed and where a bullet sails, looking late for Ismael. 3 shots, pop, pop, pop. Here's only the first shot behind him. In his head, his lines, that girl Ismail, his mother, the fast off Ramadan all explode from his skull into the June night as he topples. And suddenly there's two black brothers over him, smashing at his chest. And he's not even thinking, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And the street light above burns fluorescence into his retina. Gnats, mosquitoes, a strange yellow glow just before the red. The red. And he'll never witness his brother, his sister Jamila, his friends Baden and Khadijah, and my son Nico, hunkered in the waiting room as the surgeons huddle 2 hours to undo what can't be undone. And 3 days later, Nico stands with Abdi's friends and family, his mother just returned from Somalia, his father still dying, unable to fly. And there is no coffin to cover his sleeping face, as he's lowered 2 graves from Baden's brother. And my son grips his shaking girlfriend, and as he looks at Abdi's mother, the only Somali mother, he says, who ever accepted him, even loved him, he thinks of the track he and Abdi jammed on, the album they'd planned, and how just hours earlier at work, when he told his boss what had happened, his boss shot back, well, that's what you get for hanging around with those people. And how did they get to be my son's people? And how am I to comfort my son, weeping before me now in my study? Or chastise him for using my wife's credit card to help buy the mother's plane fare and a bus ticket for another friend to leave for Fargo so he doesn't become one more Abdi. And my son is saying, he looked at Abdi's mother's face falling into her son in the grave. They wanted to rip the clouds from the sky, rip his boss's hairs from their follicles, cut the tracks of their album that will never be finished, and the kids in school shouting at Abdi, look at me, I'm the captain, and hey, Mohammed, suicide bomber. And my son saying, I can't believe he's dead. I can't take it in, Dad. And I'm holding him as Abdi will never be held by his mother. His father, the poet, dying in Mogadishu. And I can't say I hate this world as much as you, Nico, though that too is in my heart. And so I say, Abdi's life was not his death. Your friendship was not his death. His music was not his death. And so I say, listen, he's still rapping. Those lines are still there. He's still talking to you. What is he saying? And Nico, as his body shakes in my arms, he'd want me. He'd want me to be happy. And I see Abdi's face standing beside us. And I say, thank you, Abdi. Thank you for loving my boy. Thank you.
Wow, what an appropriate message. Personal stories, like David's poem for Abdi, not only tug at our heartstrings, but I think challenge us to think more critically, both about what we typically consider to be American history, as well as the history being made today and every day. Our next talk comes from Emily Howe. She is currently a master's candidate at the University of North Carolina Gillings School of Global Public Health, and we are so very thankful that Emily had time in her undoubtedly busy schedule to share her motivating words with us. We welcome Emily to the stage.
When I got to Grinnell, I thought that I had made it. I was a small town kid from Idaho. No one even knows where Idaho is, and I was headed to a fancy private college. I was going to join all the clubs. I was going to be on the dean's list. I was going to drink coffee late at night in the library. I was going to partake in Grinnell's notorious dance parties. It was going to be great, the full American college experience. But then I started getting sick. It was slow at first. Migraine here and there, a couple missed classes a semester. And then it was sudden. I was in and out of the ER. I was failing classes I used to excel in. I was sleeping on a hallway bench between courses to conserve energy. I needed to leave Grinnell. I was able to return the next semester, and everyone treated me as if I had recovered, as if everything was normal. 5 months away, and I had found the right treatment plan, the right doctor, the right diagnosis. It takes cisgender women in the United States an average of 4 years and 4 doctors to get a diagnosis for a chronic illness, so better was pretty far from the truth. I had found ways to manage and to cope, but I still lived with the burden of undiagnosed chronic illnesses. I still had needs that didn't align perfectly with being a full-time college student, especially at Grinnell. What I needed from people when I came back was for them to acknowledge that I had taken time away. I needed people to see the changes in my body as a part of my being. I needed people to understand that I wanted to be there. I needed people to ask, what do you need? And how can I help? I needed people. See, when I started at Grinnell, I thought that hopes were a checklist, and they were things you could achieve and check off. Graduated high school, check. Got into university, check. Made friends, check. These hopes could make me happy, and I could achieve them all on my own. But when I started getting sick, my perceptions changed. My checklist of hopes was deteriorating before me, being composted to make room for things that I didn't necessarily hope for. I needed to have time for doctor's appointments, not choir rehearsals. I needed any exciting job or fellowship to also have exciting benefits and insurance. I was angry and I was frustrated, and I didn't think that I could have hope. I thought that being chronically ill without a cure had stolen hope from me. So, how do you hope when it's chronic? First, what I've learned about hope and hopeful people is that hopeful people are angry. They are frustrated. They are failing classes and changing plans and off track. If everything was fine, if everything was normal, there would be no need for hope. So I find hope in the small things, in waking up each day, hoping I don't have a migraine, in hoping my professor or supervisor will give me a little bit extra time on a project after a flare, in cute cat videos, obviously. And in the big things, I find hope in leaning into the suckiness, in acknowledging that we live in a world full of systems designed for an elite few. Certainly not designed for me and my body, nor for many of you. And then changing what we can inside and outside those systems. I have hoped the world can be more just and accessible so that I can live the life I want to live with my migraines. I don't hope to be 100% free of migraines. My body is my body, and I can't change a fundamental part of who I am. So I have hope that the world, that all of us together, can overcome our ableism instead of me bending my body until it breaks to fit in to this isolating ableist system that we live in. I have hope that the world can and will change. And to change the world, even just have hope to change the world, we need other people. We need each other. This idea of collectively reimagining a more just and accessible world is not new. It echoes the hopes of disability justice activists before me, particularly activists of color and LGBTQ activists. Activists who smashed curbs with jackhammers and explosives to get Berkeley city leaders to implement curb cuts. Who just 30 years ago crawled up the steps of the US Capitol to advocate for the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. These activists, they were angry and they were frustrated, but collectively, they had hope. Collectively, they changed the world. See, I had thought that hope was a checklist, but hope is a community garden that we all contribute to and create when we turn to each other, see each other for who we are and where we are, and ask, what do you need? And how can I help? This garden changes and it grows with the seasons as we advocate for unmet needs beyond our own, needs we might never even have considered. A more empathetic and responsive world is a more accessible and just world for everyone. We all benefit from curb cuts in the Americans with Disabilities Act. When I thought that I wouldn't be able to finish my Grinnell degree 6 years ago, or when just this past year I thought I might be on the phone with insurance every month for the rest of my life, it was so hard to find hope. It was people working within the system, a few compassionate Grinnell staff and faculty, a very patient customer service representative, and people outside of the system, my friends, my family, my community, who watered hope's roots and tended to hope's buds when I thought I could not. Together, we create a more caring and accessible Grinnell. Together, we advocate for a different health system. Together, we change the world, and together, we hold hope. Leaving 2020 and entering 2021 after a year of such tumult and global health crises that have violently reminded us that we are all dependent on one another, we have an opportunity to pause and reimagine a more just and accessible world. We have an opportunity to see a community garden from a burned and barren lot. And even if you personally don't think you need to reimagine the world, someone else does. At some point in our lives, we will all find something in the world that's inaccessible. We will all need community gardens, and we will all need people to help us hold hope. So leaving here today, use this opportunity, use this pause to turn to your neighbor, see them for who they are and where they are, and ask, what do you need? And how can I help?
Emily makes so many good points, and she leaves us with a direct call to action. With that in mind, we want to remind you of the question we asked at the very beginning. How do you define hope? TEDx conferences, although independently organized, share TED's mantra, ideas worth spreading. To us at Grinnell, this includes not only the ideas of our speakers, but of our audiences as well. So in past conferences, we've had many opportunities for our attendees to share their own ideas on our themes and topics. In our very first TEDxGrinnellCollege event in 2015, themed Speak Out, we had a drawing board. Then, when we found out that those window markers weren't actually so easy to get off the Buxbaum windows, we opted for large bubble-like post-it notes for our conference Bursting the Bubble. Most recently, in our 2018 conference themed Turn on the Light, we had a mega light bright for our audience to experiment and create with. Now, while we can't necessarily recreate these experiences in the same way this year, we do envision a virtual post-it note wall for us all to share our ideas, our thoughts, and our definitions of hope. During the upcoming brief intermission, approximately 7 minutes, we encourage you to take a restroom break, grab another cup of tea or coffee, and fill out the Qualtrics form that we have linked in the description below, which will ask you how you define hope. A few days after the event, we hope to share these definitions with you all and continue our conversation around hope. Feel free to fill out that address portion at the very end of that Qualtrics form, and you will get a TEDx Grinnell College sticker via mail in the coming weeks. We look forward to seeing you back after the break.
A huge thank you to everyone who took a minute to let us know what your definition of hope is. We're so excited to read them and share them back around. Hope is always worth spreading. Now it's time to reconvene and look to our next guest, Jitendra Dulani. Jitendra is special counsel at notable firm Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman in Washington, D.C. He maintains an active pro bono practice focusing on civil rights litigation and wrongful convictions. He's also a member of the Alumni Council. We welcome Jitendra to the stage.
Hope is something we create. But before I tell you how I discovered this, I need to take you back to the beginning, when I was homeless on the streets of Pittsburgh. I was 17 years old, and I found myself on the street. I remember it was a day like today, cold and clear. I was waiting for the 61C bus, and I had just finished giving plasma for the 4th time. They had had trouble finding a vein, and I was worried about how else I was going to get enough money to eat. Later that day, one of the guys who helped me figure out how to survive on the street pulled me aside, and he said that I wasn't going to make it. And he told me about a welfare office downtown where they might be able to help. And so that's what I did. The next day, I went into that office and tried to apply for welfare. They gave me a mishmash of forms, and I had no idea what to do. And just as I was about to give up, one of the women at the front desk came over and sat down next to me. It was her lunch hour, but she spent that time with me, helping me sort out all the forms and helping me figure out how to fill them out. Welfare saved my life. It was a hand up in every sense. The cash assistants helped me get off the street, and I got a room in a group house. The food stamps ensured that I no longer went hungry. A few weeks later, I went back to my old high school to see my senior year English teacher, Mrs. Brunger. She was the toughest teacher in the school. If you cut her class, she might fail you. But she was also extremely kind. When she saw me, she asked, "What happened? Why wasn't I at college?" And for the first time, I told somebody about all of the pain and the violence that I had endured and why I was alone and scared. Not only did she listen, but she helped put together a plan. And she made me apply to a little college in Iowa called Grinnell. I told her I'd never been west of Ohio, but she said that Grinnell was a place where I would be able to figure out who I was and who I wanted to be. And she was right. But even after I applied, I had no idea how I was going to pay for all of this. And then Grinnell did something extraordinary. They bet on me. Gretchen Zimmerman, who is the director of the financial aid office, saw my application. And she went to the Department of Education and explained that I was homeless, I had no parents, and that they needed to find a way to get me to Grinnell. And they did. I thought that once I got to college, everything would be fine. But I couldn't run away from my past. I still didn't fit in. I didn't have parents. Every time the school shut down, I was homeless again. And I was constantly doing all of the things that parents normally do: taxes, financial aid. I had 5 jobs on campus. Along the way, I got extraordinarily lucky, and I found a mentor and a champion. George Drake was a history professor who had once been the president of Grinnell. He left to go to the Peace Corps, and then he returned to teach again. I ended up being the last student added to his Southern African history class. And that started a journey that changed my life. George encouraged me to do things that I didn't think I could do. He believed in me when no one else did. One summer, he helped me get a research grant to understand human rights in South Africa. And he liked the paper so much that he sent it to Amnesty International. And the next summer, I ended up in Cape Town, covering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and actually meeting Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. That experience convinced me that I wanted to go to law school, that I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to change the world. I didn't know how. Many years later, I was invited back to Grinnell to teach a class on the Sixth Amendment and wrongful conviction. I'd spent 6 years representing a man who had been wrongfully convicted of murder. And when he was released, Grinnell asked me to come and teach this class. So I spent a week on campus, and it was thrilling. It was great to be back, to help students, to mentor them, to answer questions. And that week, I had a chance to have lunch with George. And I told him that I would never be able to repay him for all that he had done for me. And he turned to me and he laughed. He said, "Of course not. I could never repay all of the people that helped me along the way. All you can do is pay it forward and help people the way I've helped you." And he was right. And that's when I realized hope is something we create when we invest in the people around us.
Wow. Jitander's story is not only awe-inspiring, but shows us how powerful our Grinnellian community can be when we are all willing to invest in each other. Our next speaker is both a Grinnellian and a born and raised Iowan. Sarah Henderson combines her love and interest of art and history in her public service through museums. Her experiences in graduate school and museums across the country have led her back to Iowa, where she now serves as the K-12 learning specialist at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids. Today, she's here to tell us more about that story.
As a child of rural Iowa and of a family that dedicated their lives to corporate factories as welders and line painters, I can't help but wonder how many people like me actually exist working in museums. And I can tell you from the classrooms of a Georgetown Museum Studies program and the lecture halls of the Sotheby's of Art Institute program, I felt really alone and singular in my experience and perspectives. Don't get me wrong, I will never get sick of telling my novelty drive a tractor to school day stories at parties, but when it came to our intellectual discussions around what a museum has been and what it should become, I felt very outnumbered by children of wealth. Children who grew up around arts and culture and went to LACMA on their family vacations. I didn't step foot into an art museum until I went to college. And for my family vacations, we went rural trout fishing in Wisconsin, without power, I might add. So when I would sit in these classrooms, in these discussions, wanting so badly to dedicate myself to museums for the purpose of accessibility and to ensure that museums and art could be for all people and not just upper classes. And I know I'm not alone in that pursuit. Like, I know lots of museums work towards those goals, and there are articles written about how we might pursue those goals as a field. But I also know that it's not all museums working towards that goal. And some days I wonder if it's even most of us that are working towards that goal. And I still remember sitting in my first interview after grad school with the director of education at a museum that I won't name here. And I poured my heart out for 3 hours about accessibility and rural outreach and innovative ways museums could attract underserved populations and serve them. And she looked me in the eye at the end of this interview, and almost like she felt sorry for me, she said, "Your passion is inspiring, really it is, but I don't see underserved populations visiting our museum, and for that reason I don't see how your passion is going to serve this institution." So yeah, I didn't get that job, but that conversation was still really important, I think, for me to hear and for me to fully understand what the museum problem was. And we could have the whole if you build it, they will come sort of conversation. Like if we made really cool exhibitions and programs that were interesting to all people, then maybe all people would come. But that's just not the truth. It's not Field of Dreams. The fact is, you can't escape the fact that museums for centuries have been built by and for elite circles of people who collect things. That's the history, and in a lot of ways, it still is our present. But I don't want this whole conversation to be like, here's everything wrong with museums, here are the inherent problems. Instead, I want to take what I've learned in museums so far and present a solution that I've found. So I didn't get that job, but cut forward a little bit, I got an educator position at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And early on, when I first started, the museum had just been dabbling in project-based learning, which means they worked with local high school students and enriched their classrooms with long-term projects that the museum designed. And they had just started that process, and I was learning the ropes. I learned that one of our strongest school partners was Metro High School, where they hosted Metro STEAM Academy, which was a class that students could take to work on our projects. And I learned that Metro High School was comprised of 100% at-risk students, 100% students who represented underserved populations. And I realized that these were students who worked part-time jobs like I did in high school to help with family bills and pay for their car, and they were students with learning disabilities. And these were the students that woman in that interview had basically told me were never going to visit museums. And after a year of working with them, I very quickly realized that not only would they visit museums, but they were going to be the greatest asset to our museum in terms of education, exhibitions, and outreach. So, about a year in, I made my first pitch to Metro High School and the students, and my pitch was this. What if, in honor of the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, we build a 60-foot-long replica of the Berlin Wall in our community? So yeah, they kind of thought I was delusional. But shortly thereafter that pitch, me and 3 of those educators were out in the vacant lot next to the museum mapping out where we thought the wall was going to go. So they clearly didn't think I was that crazy because they had the vision and the excitement to go stand in a vacant lot and count out 60 steps to see where our wall might be someday in the future. And I took a photo of that moment because I was like, if we're actually crazy enough to do this, we need this first physical step literally memorialized. So we started working with students that fall to design the wall, what materials we were going to use. I recruited tons and tons of mentors from the community who worked in construction, architecture, engineering, materials production. And students worked with these adult professional mentors to refine their design and eventually build it. We worked with excavators, and the goal was always that this wall was going to be more than just a wall. It was going to be a community art space. It was going to host art residencies and programs and lectures. It was going to be the forefront of our 2019 year. And so when I would watch a student sitting down with a structural engineer calculating in complex math that I can't follow the thickness of the wall so that it could withstand 60-mile-per-hour Iowa winds, I don't think that student was like, cool, I'm getting science credit. I think he was like, yeah, I really don't want this wall to blow down because it's going to be in my community and I want to make a difference. And that's so much more powerful than a science worksheet or something like that. So the wall gets built through incredible partnerships with these students and those mentors. And we used the wall for 6 months at the museum in all those educational programmings I talked about. And the most incredible thing was that we saw almost immediately and without direct effort that Metro students wanted to come to all of those programs. They wanted to come to the art lectures from an Egyptian artist who talked about the Egyptian Revolution. Like, they wanted to come sit and listen to him talk for an hour, which, like, if you know teenagers and you work with teenagers, kind of crazy that they would give you that on their Saturday evening. But they did, and they brought their friends, and they took photos with the artist like he was a celebrity. And These were the folks that I was told would be almost impossible to get to come to a museum. And they were coming to the museum like it was just where they hung out, where things happened for them, because they built the thing that was in the backyard and they had been a million times to build it. So it was just a regular part of their day or their weekend or their evening that they might be here. And that was maybe my proudest accomplishment as an educator, is that we built this sense of belonging for those students, because their classroom had been the vacant lot next to our museum, and it had been our exhibits in our classroom and my office. So we build the wall, it becomes this backdrop for all these programs. It got painted by the public every day. We hosted free art supplies, and anybody and everybody who came to the museum could go and paint it. It was a photo shoot backdrop for so many photographers, and I saw senior photos taken in front of it. I saw a student rap video filmed in front of it. I even heard that it was a Pokemon Go stop on the phone game. So it was beloved, truly, but our plan had always been to tear it down. So on November 19th, 2019, 30 years after the fall of the original Berlin Wall, we invited our students, the mentors, their families, the teachers, to come and help us tear that wall down, as a symbolic gesture that we were constantly going to be working towards solidarity and democracy and freedom of speech, and that no walls anywhere should exist to separate people. And in 2019, you might remember, this is the height of when certain groups in the United States were talking about building a border wall on the US-Mexico border. And so it was really apt at this moment that we were going to symbolically tear down this symbol of division and hate and oppression. And as I watched my students and their grandparents and their younger siblings take chunks of this wall off with their sledgehammers, I couldn't help but feel this overwhelming sense of hope. Hope for our country, for our community, for the next generation that I was proudly watching swing sledgehammers. And all of that hope rested on the shoulders and the hard work of the underserved populations that allegedly would never visit museums. It's pretty incredible.
So exciting to see this kind of organizing on the community level. Thanks, Sarah. Our next talk comes from Iranian-American comedian, actress, writer, and filmmaker Negin Farsad. In this talk from 2016, Negin shows us that pushing for a better future may not always look how we expect it to. Enjoy!
So, I'm an Iranian-American Muslim female, like all of you, and I'm also a social justice comedian, something that I insist is an actual job. Now, to explain what that is, let me tell you how I got here. I've performed all over the country, and let me tell you, America is majestic, right? It's got breathtaking nature, waffle houses, and diabetes as far as the eye can see. It is really something. Now, the American population can be broken up into three main categories. There's mostly wonderful people, haters, and Florida. Now, besides Florida, the most troubling category here are the haters, okay? They are a minority, but they overcompensate by being extra loud. They have the Napoleon complex of demographics, and yes, some of the men do wear heels. Now, as a social justice comedian, it's my goal to convert these haters, because they hate a lot of things which lead to negative outcomes, like racism, violence, and Ted Nugent. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm probably missing 3 to 7 items. But the point is, we have to reckon with the haters. But there's variance within this group, and it's not efficient to go after all of them, right? So what I've done is I've created a highly scientific taxonomy of haters. I basically took all of the haters, I put them in a petri dish like a scientist, and this is what I found. First off, we have the trolls. These are your garden variety digital haters. They're the people who have quit their jobs so that they can post on YouTube videos all day long. There's also the drive-by haters. Now, these people will be at a stoplight, they'll wait for the light to turn green, and when it does, they yell, "Go back to your own country." Now, back in the day, they would have actually gotten out of their cars and hated you to your face, but they just don't make them like they used to, which is another sign of the decline in America. Now, The next category is the mission-oriented bigot whose group affiliation gives them cover for hating hater. Now, these guys like to hate via a seemingly nice organization like a church or a nonprofit, and they oftentimes like to speak in an old-timey voice. But the group I'm most interested in is the swing hater. Now, the swing hater is sister to the swing voter, right? They just can't decide. They're like ideological sluts who move from hating to not hating, and they do it because they don't have enough information. And this is the group I like to target with social justice comedy. Now, why comedy? Because on a scale of comedy to brochure, the average American prefers comedy, as you can see from this graph. Comedy is very popular, and by the way, this is a mathematically accurate graph generated from fake numbers. Now, the question is, why does social justice comedy work? Well, because first off, it makes you laugh, right? And when you're laughing, you enter into a state of openness. And in that moment of openness, a good social justice comedian can stick in a whole bunch of information, and if they're really skilled, a rectal exam. Now, here are some ground rules for social justice comedy. First off, it's not partisan, okay? This isn't political comedy, this is about justice, and no one is against justice. 2, it's inviting and warm. It makes you feel like you're sitting inside of a burrito. 3, it's funny but sneaky, like you could be hearing an interesting treatise on income inequality that's encased in a really sophisticated poop joke, right? Now, here's how I see social justice comedy working. Now, a few years ago, I rounded up a bunch of Muslim American comedians in a nonviolent way, and we went around the country to places like Alabama, Arizona, Tennessee, Georgia, places where they love the Muzzies, and we did stand-up shows, and we called the tour "The Muslims Are Coming." Now, we turned this into a movie, and then after the movie came out, a known hate group spent $300,000 on an anti-Muslim poster campaign with the MTA, that's the New York City subway system. Now, the posters were truly offensive, not to mention poorly designed. I mean, if you're going to be bigoted, you might as well use a better font. But we decided, why not launch our own poster campaign, right, that says nice things about Muslims while promoting the movie. So myself and fellow comedian Dean Obidala decided to launch the Fighting Bigotry with Delightful Posters campaign. We raised the money, worked with the MTA for over 5 months, got the posters approved, and then 2 days after they were supposed to go up, the MTA decided to ban the posters, citing political content. Let's take a look at a couple of those posters. Here's one. Facts about Muslims. Muslims invented the concept of a hospital. Okay. Fact, grown-up Muslims can do more push-ups than baby Muslims. Fact, Muslims invented Justin Timberlake. Let's take a look at another one. The ugly truth about Muslims. They have great frittata recipes. Now, clearly, frittatas are considered political by the MTA. Either that, or the mere mention of Muslims in a positive light was considered political, but it isn't. It's about justice. So we decided to change our Fighting Bigotry with Delightful Posters campaign and turn it into the Fighting Bigotry with a Delightful Lawsuit campaign. So basically what I'm saying is a couple of dirtbag comedians took on a major New York City agency, and the comedians won. Yeah, thank you. Victory was a very weird feeling. I was like, is this what blonde girls feel like all the time? Because this is amazing. All right, here's another example. I'm asked everywhere I go, why don't Muslims denounce terrorism? We do, but okay, I'll take the bait. So I decided to launch thedailydenouncer.com. It's a website that denounces terrorism every day of the week while taking the weekends off. Let's take a look at an example. They generally appear as single-panel cartoons. I denounce terrorism. I also denounce people who never fill the paper tray. The point of the website is that it denounces terrorism while recognizing that it's ridiculous that we have to constantly denounce terrorism. But if bigotry isn't your thing, social justice comedy is useful for all sorts of issues. For example, myself and fellow comedian Lee Camp went to the Cayman Islands to investigate offshore banking. Now, the United States loses something like $300 billion a year in these offshore tax havens. Not to brag, but at the end of every month, I have something like $5 to $15 in disposable income. So we walked into these banks in the Cayman Islands and asked if we could open up a bank account with $8.27. The bank managers would indulge us for 30 to 45 seconds, right, before calling security. Security would come out, brandish their weapons, and then we would squeal with fear and run away because, and this is the last rule of social justice comedy, sometimes it makes you want to take a dump in your pants. Now, most of my work is meant to be fun. It's meant to generate a connection and laughter. But yes, sometimes I get run off the ground by security. Sometimes I get mean tweets and hate mail. Sometimes I get voicemails saying that if I continue telling my jokes, they'll kill me and they'll kill my family. And those death threats are definitely not funny. But despite the occasional danger, I still think that social justice comedy is one of our best weapons. I mean, we've tried a lot of approaches to social justice, like war and competitive ice dancing. But still, a lot of things are still kind of awful. So I think it's time we try and tell a really good poop joke. Thank you.
The hope and joy that comes out of laughter is so potent, and I think Nagin's talk is a really great example of that. Our next speaker, Ajuna Kyaruzi, was born and raised in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, which is also where she happened to film her warm and sunny talk. Ajuna is a software engineer at Google, and she works as a part of the Google Maps notifications team. Listen now to hear about the crucial role that community support plays for Ajuna, both at home in Tanzania and in her experiences as an international Black woman in tech.
Hello, I'm here to talk to you about the power of community and why it's my vision of hope. We've all heard of this African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. I'm actually from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and I'd never heard this proverb before. So I looked through all the different Tanzanian proverbs I knew and tried to find something that could be similar. And the closest I found in Swahili was Umoja ni nguvu, tengano ni udhaifu, which means there's strength in unity. Community is such a big cornerstone of all life's major moments in Tanzania. If you think about all of the biggest milestones of your life, whether it's child rearing, weddings, funerals, or just going about day-to-day activities, your community in Tanzania is so closely involved in each of these. Fundraising is one major way that the community shows out and shows their support. We fundraise for all of life's major events, and actually it's quite normal to fundraise for weddings. My parents have been fundraising for weddings for their friends, their coworkers, even their coworkers' children. And all of this community has been waiting for an opportunity to give all of that right back to us. So they all keep looking at me, waiting for their chance to donate to my potential future wedding and give back that same energy. Other ways that people are involved in fundraising from all of life's major events is through different organizations that we have. One of them is called Vikoba, or I've heard it called Susu in West Africa, which are these informal gatherings of trusted folks who meet up to save money for life's planned events. So they can be anything for like school fees is quite common, or bills of any kind. So how they work is you have a group of folks who meet up at a regular basis, maybe weekly or monthly, and give a certain amount of money each time, and one person takes that money for that round, and there's a treasurer to keep track of who took what and when. And this is really helpful for people like my aunt, who needed to use it when she wanted to save up money for my cousin's school fees, despite the fact there was a lot of other things going on. Something else is actually called a SACCOS, which is a savings and credit cooperative, where folks use this to save for even bigger opportunities in life, like buying a home or buying a car. My mom's actually been part of a SACCOS and went into it when it was time for my older sister to go to college, because you can use these in order to take out loans at a really good interest rate, because you each take out time and put money into it and get it at a good rate when you need a loan. So when I went to university 7 years ago, I was trying to figure out what is a way for me to build up this community that I've had the luxury of just being born into in Tanzania. And so I sought out where I could find it, and there are tons of places that you can find your community, whether it's where you practice your religion, where you volunteer, or even through work. Other ways that I've found the connection between all of the things I've enjoyed in Tanzania and found them in the US are like fundraising is basically GoFundMe, or all of these SACCOs are what your local credit union can do for you. And I've been able to find a lot of community through work. I currently work as a software engineer, which, as folks might know, tech is in a very diverse field. It's really white and Asian men dominated. So I've been able to find community and folks who look like me to support me through this. So the first part that I found my major community was when I was still at Grinnell doing my computer science degree. I got a chance to go to a conference called Grace Hopper. Grace Hopper is actually the world's largest conference for women technologists, and the year that I went, 8,000 women went, and it's only grown from there. The first time that I went, on stage, there was a Ugandan woman being given a prize because she had made a coding community for people in her local village to teach them how to code. And I got a chance to talk to her afterwards, and she's one of the people who told me how important it is to have a community of folks from work who look like you to support you through your career. So I've been able to lean on that community many times, and since I've graduated, I've actually joined a community called DevColor, which is for Black software engineers, and I met with them in New York for the past 3 years. And I actually leaned on one of my friends from DevColor when I joined a new team at work, and I was getting really anxious because I didn't know what was a good question to ask anymore. I was struggling with imposter syndrome, and my friend immediately became a coach, and she started reaching out to me on an almost daily basis to find out what I'm going through. Have I asked a question? Have I been stuck? And she became my first line of contact in order for me to build up my confidence and to start to trust my team and myself that I was asking the right questions. And I've been able actually to give that back by organizing a working hour as we're being virtual and have new members who've joined our team that we've never actually met before. So we meet up once a week, and it's kind of an informal, anyone can ask questions, and we drop in as you need, and it's been amazing for us. So to wrap up, I want to ask you, what is your community like? Do they give you hope? Have you been able to get something from it or give to it, especially now that we're virtual and it's a little harder to meet in person? I hope that they give you hope as mine does to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajuna. We're so grateful for your powerful words about community. Our next and very last talk comes from Meghna Ravishankar. Meghna is an international development practitioner from Bangalore, India, who now works in food and agriculture. She's a dear friend of TEDxGrinnellCollege, and we're so grateful to have her.
Something you should know about me is that I'm an indecisive overthinker. When I was asked to give this talk, one of the guiding questions posed to me was, how do you define hope? What an absolutely terrifying question to ask. One, to an indecisive overthinker, because how could I possibly settle on a definition? Two, terrifying question, because life as we know it collapsed around us this past year. So who has been spending their time defining hope? But as I thought about this, I realized that I've never had a consistent definition of hope. Each time that I have felt hope in my life, I've always learned something from it. Kind of like morals from Panchatantra stories or Aesop's fables. So instead of attempting to define this very tricky, scary word, I thought I would share some anecdotes with you. The year is 2004. It was the end of the day at school, and I was standing with a friend near the school gate waiting for the school bus to take us home. Earlier that day, our teachers had told us that there would be a city-wide strike the next day, which could mean that school could be cancelled. So naturally, my friend and I are in deep discussion about this. And at the conclusion of our conversation, I decided that I needed to say something profound to manifest. And so I went with, I really wish we won't have school tomorrow. Brilliant contribution to this conversation. My friend immediately stopped me and said something that has stuck with me ever since. She said, "Don't wish, hope, because if you hope, it will actually come true." I'm sorry, we have to stop, because who told this 9-year-old this?
How did she know this? Anyway, if this was a fairy tale, this is where the narrator would come in and tell you that the moral of the story is that hoping and wishing are completely different things and you shouldn't conflate them. Here I am, 9 years old, vigorously taking mental notes because my mind has just been blown by this idea. Fast forward, the year's 2005. I am 10 years old, a little bit wiser now, and laser focused on a single goal: convincing my parents that this would be the year to begin celebrating Christmas. Now, my family didn't celebrate Christmas, but I was watching American and British movies growing up, and so I was beginning to understand that I could make some gains out of this whole Christmas concept. So I insisted that we do all of the traditions that I'd seen on television: buy a tree, decorate it, write letters to Santa Claus. Most importantly, expect gifts under the tree. My sister and I were busy writing our letters to Santa Claus with the lists of the things that we wanted. We were aiming high. I wanted an iPod, and my sister wanted a flute, orchestra flute to be specific. I remembered my lesson from my friend the year before: don't wish, hope. And so I channeled my hope straight into my letter to Santa Claus, folded it up, gave it to my dad, and asked him to send it to the North Pole right away. FedEx it if you must, it's important. A few days later, I received a letter from the man himself, Santa Claus, and it brought devastating news. Even though I had hoped with all my heart, Santa Claus said that I needed to memorize my multiplication tables 1 through 13, and only then I would be eligible for an iPod. So not only did I have to hope, but I had to work for it. Not that I was opposed to working for it, I just didn't know that those were the rules of hoping for something. Here I am thinking that I'm so clever for pulling off this elaborate Christmas gift scam, when in reality, I got Uno reversed, scammed instead. Now, if this was a fairy tale, this is where the narrator would walk in and tell you the grossly simplified moral, which is, you can want anything, and you can have it if you work for it. So simple. My 10-year-old self taking notes again, because clearly I don't have this hope thing down yet. Fast forward again, the year is 2006. I'm working on a school project where we had to make a map of our lives from birth into the future. Now, a project like this needed a little creativity, a little imagination, but also ambition. At that time, I loved animals and environmental conservation, so with all this in mind, I began the project. I was a very ambitious 11-year-old because I had decided that by the year 2026, I would have saved all tigers from extinction. That's right, me. Now, in my defense, the year before I had learned you can't just hope, you have to work for it. Straightforward. And so I had determined by some calculation that 2026 would allow me ample time to work towards my tiger saving credentials. Makes sense, right? Wrong, because I have yet to save even a single tiger to this day. Now, the moral of this one is perhaps a bit more abstract, but if a narrator were to walk in, they would tell you that hope can change, and that's okay. Though these stories are small, I think they illustrate my point. I've never had a consistent definition of hope. My trajectory of understanding hope began with the idea that hope is just a casual emotion, nothing more than that. But as I grew up, I began to see how complicated it was, how many layers it had. Each time that I felt hope, the bus stop conversation, the Christmas scam, the school project, I learned something about my own notion of hope, but also about myself. Hope is a teacher. The philosopher Isabel Stengers once said that hope is the difference between probability and possibility. That gap between active and passive is one that I have thought about since the bus stop conversation, but haven't quite understood until now. I've come to interpret hope as the bridge between those two things. By hoping, I work and I stay accountable to myself in order to cross that bridge between this fear of the possibility of disappointment or failure to the very real probability of joy, success, excitement. Hope is action. Since I was younger, I thought that my hope had to be on a linear upward trajectory, getting bigger and larger than life as I got older. But with the year that we have had, I've really been struggling with this idea. Here we are, the year is 2021, and strangely, all I can muster hope for right now is to be a regular at a coffee shop. My younger self's version of hope was the equivalent of getting on a jet ski in the middle of the ocean at full speed, expecting to reach land. In reality, I think my hope is more like a canoe, one that can alter course, be set back, but ultimately keep moving because I keep rowing. Hope can evolve with you. Though I don't have the energy right now to keep hoping big, I continue to remind myself that even though my boat isn't moving fast, it is still moving, and that's something. Maybe my hope doesn't have to be as grand as saving all the tigers in 5 years, but perhaps it can be learning the barista's name, becoming friends with a neighbor, or recreating your mother's recipes. Even a few months ago, I wouldn't have considered these things actions of hope. But as I think about it, all of those things have taught me something about myself, and that is moving my boat forward. With time, maybe those small actions of hope can become ambitious, imaginative, and maybe even audacious once again.
Meghna makes such a good point. It's important to recognize that our own definitions of hope can ebb and flow in the ever-changing world that we find ourselves in, and that those definitions don't necessarily have to match the definitions of those around us. Although definitely not the usual in-person conference we originally had in mind, we are so incredibly grateful for the opportunity to bring together Grinnell students, staff, faculty, alumni, and community members from around the globe today, and we really hope you enjoyed it.
Before we let you go, we have a few people who assisted in the production of TEDxGrinnellCollege that we'd like to thank. First, we need to thank the Wilson Center for Innovation and Leadership, who sponsors TEDxGrinnellCollege.
We want to offer a huge thank you to our speaker coaches, Kathy Clemens-Beasley and Nolan Bogus. Together, these wonderful alum guide our speakers in the writing and recording of their TED Talks.
We would also like to thank the TEDx committee members who assisted in the planning of our conference. And finally, we'd like to thank you for coming to TEDxGrinnellCollege today.